And the Real News Network did a little show. And they first started off the show with kind of talking about the Hillary Clinton tweet, the Russian asset, whatnot. They debunked that. But this became one of those, Tulsi Gabbard isn't a Russian asset, but she's more complicated than that. And when the but came, it was like, oh, no. So Jeet Heer, who writes for The Nation, wrote an article on this as well. But this is him with Mark Steiner, and I think Mark Steiner has an interview scheduled with Tulsi coming up soon, so because he had mentioned that he's going to get to talk to her, so I can't wait to see that. I like Mark Steiner. But we've been seeing some kind of push from the Real News Network, and I'm really glad that Tulsi's going to go to that station and answer a lot of these questions. One of the interviews right here was Jeet Heer, which was interesting. If you go to Jeet Heer's Twitter, you'll see he's
so dumb.
he's a little very much Trump alarmist, which is just this and that, whatnot. And don't get me wrong, if you want to talk policy, you want to knock him back, that's cool. But he likes to project a lot. So after we're not going to even go over the Russian Gate stuff, because the Russian asset stuff, because I think we all agree it was really a dumb, idiotic attack. There's no legs to it. There's no proof. So they kind of push that out of the way, but then they kind of get into. But she's not the type of candidate that is really anti-war, and she's not the type of candidate the left should be looking at. So here is from 7:55. We're gonna go and start this right here and watch what Jeet Heer says.
I mean, it's not so simple.
No. I think to understand, Gabbard, you have to understand the war on terror and the kind of which has been going on for long enough that there are soldiers serving in Afghanistan who were born after 9/11. And Gabbard, has a very interesting background in Hawaii, belonging to a group that's kind of offshoot of Hare Krishna. But in 2004, she joined the military and she served in Iraq in a sort of combat zone. And I think a lot of her politics is the sort of frustration that many soldiers have with the war on terror, with especially the sort of boots on the ground strategy and the regime change strategy. But her alternative is very similar to Trump. It's like more rubble, less trouble. What you do instead of like Bush-style regime change or Obama-style regime change is you support the hardline dictators in the region, use drones and targeted assassinations. And so it's not something that I think the left should be very comfortable with. She calls herself a hawk, and she is a hawk.
Well, I mean,
they always say that. They always use that one quote.
Well, yeah, we're going to kind of dive into that quote a little bit. But once again, the more rebel, less trouble. False. Bullshit. Okay, Tulsi talks about Timber Sycamore and what we did in Syria, who we funded. We gave Idlib, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all these caliphates, Wahhabism caliphates, money and weapons to go kill the Kurds, to go kill Assad troops, okay? So she knows right away that is her enemy. She understands this. She said this at town hall. She spoke about this. So this whole more rebel, less trouble is bullshit. And I want to just play the next part too as well, because then she does talk about the hawk versus the dove stuff. Let's play another minute of this real quick. But it's just a projection. There's no evidence whatsoever that says that Tulsi's going to fund rebels like Obama did, like...
He compared her to Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, somebody today compared Tulsi to Bush. I mean, come on. Give me a break. It's laughable at this point now. Okay?
Yeah, that's why I'm laughing.
Go ahead.
In your article, you wrote that you had this quote here in your article. You said, in short, when it comes to the war against terrorists, I'm a hawk. Gabbard told newspaper in 2018. And when it comes to counterproductive wars of regime change, I'm a dove. And as McCreddick notes, you write to this fellow who wrote in Jacobin that you quote, Gabbard is offering nationalism in anti-war garb, reinforcing instead of undercutting the toxic rhetoric that treats foreigners as less deserving of dignity than Americans. So let's wrestle with that for a moment. I mean, how real do you think that is? I mean, and it's not an uncommon thing to say we don't want to end up overthrowing governments and starting wars, but how do you respond to terrorism? So this is something Americans wrestle with as well. And she may, in some senses, be hitting a pulse of what a lot of Americans are confused about and wrestling with.
That's right. And I think, as I said, she's a product of the war on terror. But the solution that she's come to, I think, is a very problematic solution and is very Trump-like. And I think this is one reason why Trump has had some success. But we have to really challenge his politics, that the best way is not to do regime change, but to just support really terrible dictators and to sort of do selective counterterrorism. I think what gets left out of the equation, what gets left out of her equation is diplomacy. And that's what someone like Bernie Sanders offers. That Bernie Sanders has a more like a sort of social democratic foreign policy, and he recognizes we have to actually really get at some of the root causes of these problems. So we have to actually have diplomacy to deal with Israel-Palestine, and we have to have democracy promotion that's not based on sending in the Marines, but actually like using diplomatic resources.
So
he has no idea what he's talking about.
None. He just really does not. And this guy writes for The Nation once again too. And she even said sending in Marines, whatnot. Listen, I like Bernie Sanders, but to tell you the truth, when it comes to foreign policy, Tulsi Gabbard has been way better. She's also very much evolved as well. She keeps evolving. She's the only one who talks and calls out sanctions. Now, you can remember we had the show with her here, and Fiorella asked, we talked about it. Take a look at our show right here, 2035, and we asked her in the seat about sanctions because nobody was really talking about sanctions. And shortly after this show, I heard Mike Gravel go, sanctions are an act of war. But a lot of people in Congress never even know what sanctions do. Take a look.
Right now, as far as foreign diplomacy, do you support Jimmy Carter's assertion that Maduro was legitimately elected? And also, do you feel like our sanctions are mostly to blame for the economic situation that has developed in Venezuela?
I haven't heard Jimmy Carter's statement. There have been a lot of differing views on Maduro's election itself. He's the leader of that country. The United States needs to keep our hands off of what the Venezuelan people are currently going through right now, which is determining what kind of leadership in future that they want for themselves.
Right.
That is ultimately the bottom line. I think there's no question that our sanctions have certainly played a role in exacerbating the humanitarian crisis that exists there and the hardship that the Venezuelan people are dealing with. This is one of the problems with our sanctions regime overall. And I just found this out because I was looking for information about what are the impacts of our sanctions around the world and who is suffering as a result. Because most often what we're hearing is it's not the intended quote unquote targets, whether it's leaders in the government or whatever, it is the people in these countries who end up really suffering. And
the super chat right now is going crazy over your answer, by the way.
So we see, once again, we asked her, there's no mechanism in government. However, she understands, and she somehow even came full-fledged to this, because now you put there this Twitter here, and what she says right now, she's pretty much calling out sanctions for being bad. And it's part of her speech. It's one of her two, Johnny, if you could put that tweet up. It says the ratcheting up the retaliatory actions between the U.S. and Iran will lead to war that will be devastating people on both countries. As president, I will re-enter the Iran nuclear deal and end the sanctions against Iran to move back to the precipice of war. And also the precipice of war, excuse me. And also below that, too, she even says right here where she calls them draconian sanctions. So to say that she hasn't involved is ridiculous. She's the only president who's calling them out. These sanctions are wrong. These draconian sanctions are wrong. Okay, nobody uses this language. Only Tulsi Gabbard. So you can see how much she has moved, how much she's evolved. And also, too, fam, when it comes to the she's a hawk versus a dove, people got to understand what that's all about. The hawk stuff is the Wahhabi Caliphate. It's Saudi Arabia. She does not like Saudi Arabia, what they do, what they stand for. So when she says she's going to be a hawk, she's talking about these maniacs that we supported in Sycamore Timber when it came to Syria, okay? That's who she's talking about. And here's something even more important. She doesn't have to go to war with them. She doesn't. All she has to do is go to Saudi Arabia when she becomes the president and says, you know what? We're no longer going to do business with you. Bye-bye.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Just feel like it's really interesting to see the establishment and people like The Nation and these sort of people kind of like try to say that this woman who is calling out the biggest like symbol of the military industrial complex, Hillary Clinton, who has been calling out the entire military industrial complex, who has said that we need to stop our involvement in general in these regime change wars, who has said that, you know, we need to stop funding the war machine and that's sending these people to die, is all of a sudden trying to twist her into being like this pro-war Bush Trump like monster, when she is anything further than that. I mean, you can bring up Obama and say he got us involved in 7 wars, proxy wars. He was the droner in chief. I mean, he was this guy. Yet all of a sudden, this woman who has called out the entire complex is now being turned out to be this sort of like hawk, and like, oh no, she actually wants war and she wants this. It's like, no, there is really no evidence of that. It just seems quite the contrary, that these people are trying to smear her because they don't want her to touch the war machine. A lot of these people that work for the nation and these big networks and these people like the Washington Post, these people have ties to the military industrial complex. They have advertisement for Raytheon right after. And so you have to remember who has good connections with the military industrial complex as far as the weapons is Elizabeth Warren and Raytheon and her green militarism. And it's really interesting to see the entire neo-progressive is what I'm going to start calling them, a side of the Democratic Party just being like so anti-Tulsi, when she is literally saying, we're going to disarm, we're going to stop the sanctions, we're going to stop giving weapons to Saudi Arabia. And she continues today, and that's what PAS is going to cover, like speaking out against Saudi Arabia, who are very dangerous.
Well, you cut the cord with them.
I want to see it more with Netanyahu. I want to see her speak out against Netanyahu.
First things first, when it comes to hawk versus dove, what she's going to do is not necessarily be a crazy hawk as far as weaponry. She's going to stop the funding. She's going to stop doing business with Saudi Arabia. She's going to pretty much tell them no more weapons, no more war, and stop funding them, because she's going to go get a Green New Deal back over in back home. So she's not going to need the oil. She's going to stop funding them, and that's going to be that when it comes to Saudi Arabia. And that's going to cut them by the throat, because if they don't have us to support them anymore, that's how you start going after the hawk on terror. That's it.